Welcome, everyone. Welcome back from the coffee break. And welcome to this final panel discussion of this year's Vienna Migration Conference. My name is Sarah Schläger, and I'll be the moderator for the session on EU migration and asylum policy reform. Are we breaking gridlocks? It's become sort of a tradition at the Vienna Migration Conference that we dedicate one panel solely to the discussion of EU migration policies. And I think we've heard quite a lot already that can be said that this has been quite a dynamic year for EU migration policymakers, not least because of the urgency with which solutions had to be found to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and for those displaced by the war, but also because pressure has been increasing to finally move forward and to find a common solution and a common approach to adopt a comprehensive migration management reform that was proposed by the von der Leyen Commission, the so-called new Pact on Migration and Asylum. We've also heard about that already quite a bit during this conference. And, well, I think probably all of you know, or can judge from the title, that this has certainly not been an easy task. But with a view to reform, and while some member state positions seem to be absolutely immovable, we have recently witnessed developments that have impacted but not yet eliminated certain stalemates. So I'm very pleased that for a discussion on where we stand, what's at stake, and what needs to be done to secure EU migration policy reform, I'm joined by 4 distinguished panelists who have been observing, developing, discussing, and defining EU migration policy for many years. And I'd like to welcome, I think you've already known Beate Gminder, who's the Deputy Director-General of DG Home. She was already kind enough to be on our last panel. Ms. Elena Yoncheva, who is a member of the European Parliament, Mr. Jean Mafart, who is the Director of the Directorate for European and International Affairs of the Ministry of Interior in France, and Ms. Susan Lynch, who is the Chief Brussels Correspondent of Political Europe. So just a few words on how I aim to spend the next hour or so. I'd like to start with 2 questions to the panel, then open to questions and reactions from the audience, and then come back for a closing round. So the clock is ticking, so let's get started. And I'd really like to focus during this first round on the state of play of EU migration and asylum policy, and especially hear from the different perspectives of the EU institutions on this panel, but also from you as a representative of the media. And actually, Susan, if you don't mind, I'd like to start out with you right away. So you've been observing EU politics as a journalist for almost a decade, with some time away in Washington, D.C. But I wanted to ask you, with a view to EU migration and asylum policies, what is your assessment on the latest developments and what stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say, I'm obviously coming from a different perspective than a lot of people in this room as a journalist covering EU politics. And what makes this issue so interesting, quite frankly, to cover is that it is so political. And yes, a lot of this is very technical, and that's what we'll probably discuss today. But it also, like everything in the EU, you know, the story really is the politics. You know, you can hide behind the technicalities and the policy, which are obviously very important, but that's why it's interesting, and that's why it's so dynamic, because you have different governments coming in, you have different leaders, and that shapes the way policy is formed, be it who's in control in the Commission, in the Parliament, or indeed in national capitals. One, big picture comment, I've just been thinking about recently is I was in Brussels for 4 years with the Irish Times, and I covered the migration crisis of 2015 and 2016, travelling around Europe. Then I was in the US, where incidentally immigration was also a theme, but I'm now back in Brussels a little over a year. And one thing I've really noticed is that I think with this migration topic, particularly with the influx of refugees from Ukraine, this has put Central and Eastern European countries at the heart, driving European policy making to an extent I don't think that they have ever before since 2004. We had the Eurozone crisis, with COVID, the first migration strategy. I don't think you heard those voices. I think now they're very much, because they are seen as having, frankly, the moral high ground because of their strong view on Ukraine, I think they're now having a stronger voice. So it's going to be very interesting to watch how that plays out. In terms of what's been happening, obviously there was a breakthrough earlier this year during the French presidency, or at least it was presented to us as a breakthrough, this idea of trying to get some kind of progress on the Migration Pact, and the idea that it would be a kind of an incremental step-by-step approach. And I know President Macron held this dinner with ministers in Lille. That was a kind of a moment where he set that out and then kind of returned to that. But of course, you know, we've been here before with great ideas and great breakthroughs. Is there political will to get this through? I did think it was very interesting that Commissioner Skinas mentioned on Monday evening that he felt that the upcoming Swedish presidency, followed by the Spanish presidency, offers a moment to really make progress, because for different reasons those two countries may want to advance migration policy. Now, of course, there's a lot of speculation about the new shape of the Swedish government, more right-wing government there, about how that will impact migration policy. There's also a big unknown about Italy and the new government there and how that's going to impact migration policy. But I thought that was quite interesting. It's a bit of a takeaway that they're seeing that maybe next year there is some kind of an opportunity there to advance this with the aim of getting agreement on the Migration Pact by 2024.
Thank you so much, Susan, and definitely also on mentioning what Mr. Skinas had said. I'm very happy also that Jean is here with us today, because he can tell us more about actually the gradual approach and what happened during the French presidency. And also like the hopeful tone that Skinas, and now you mentioned Vice President Skinas, and that you now also reiterated that there's still hope to move forward on the new pact. So moving to you, Jean, you've been dedicated very much to EU migration and asylum policies for a long time, and you also held a strategic role now in the recent French presidency of the Council. So I wanted to ask you, looking back at the French presidency, which also had to handle an unforeseen emergency with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which achievements were critical for EU migration and asylum policy reform? And maybe you can also already some of the challenges that you encountered, maybe some of the things that didn't work out quite as planned.
Yeah, but first I would like to make a small correction. The meeting between the president and the ministers was not in Lille. Oh. It was in Tourcoing, a few kilometers from Lille. But I have to precise it, because Tourcoing is my minister's town. But the informal JHA took place in Lille. So yes, there's a breakthrough and the momentum, I think. It must be said that we benefited from favorable circumstances. First, it's a detail, but it's an important one, almost the end of the pandemic crisis. When you look back at the previous presidencies, which were a bit mired by the pandemic conditions, it was really difficult to lead negotiations. And I think it would have been impossible to obtain significant progress on the pact in video conferences. That's a very important detail. Second, in last year, the migratory flows to Europe were relatively small. About, I think, 130,000 people last year. And there's a kind of paradox here, because the most important the flows are, the more important, the more difficult it is to hold quiet discussions in order to make progress on such issues. Of course, the 2015 crisis brought much progress. For instance, we strengthened Frontex mandate. But the discussion on policy migration, on the migration policy, and in particular on asylum, was very difficult. So it's a circumstance that helped us as well. But of course, there was the Ukrainian crisis, as you mentioned, and I must say that for several weeks, we were totally unable to say whether we would be able to resume discussions, because it has to be reminded that the discussions on the pact were completely frozen for 2 months. And finally, at the end of April, we were able to resume those discussions, and in a very short spell of time, the member states were able to reach a compromise in the Council. There's also an important element. The Pact means a complete change of approach in comparison with the discussions on the asylum package. And that's very important to mention, because the Pact provides a comprehensive framework. Asylum is an important part of it, of course, but there was also in the Pact the external dimension and the borders. And the screening is of particular importance in that regard. And that's why during the French presidency we tried to establish a link with the modernization of Schengen. And I think this issue of borders is at the intersection between the Pact and this reform of screening. But that's a very important change, because not only did this Pact provide a comprehensive framework of discussion, and we have to be thankful to the Commission for that, but it also changed the nature of the discussions, because we didn't focus anymore on a quota approach or on a theological discussion between responsibility and responsibility. The discussion was totally different. And one of the challenges, precisely, was to make those discussions different from the discussions that were held from 2016 to 2019. And there's a performative aspect in this, because if we all had the impression that we were resuming the same discussions, it would have failed. So this change of approach is really crucial. But of course, the inconvenience of that comprehensive framework is that it was a huge package. And during the preparation phase of the presidency, about 1 year ago, we realized that it was impossible to obtain a global, comprehensive agreement on the Pact. So there were two options: either break the package, but it had never worked before, or try something else, and that something else is the gradual approach that you mentioned. As my minister said at the time, if the choice is between everything and nothing, at the end it will be nothing. So we have to make progress on all the dimensions of the Pacts at the same time, but without trying to obtain an agreement on the whole Pact at the end of the presidency. That was impossible. So this gradual approach was meant to obtain progress pragmatically, but without breaking the package. And that's very important. And that's why, although there was no text that was ready in terms of solidarity, it was very important to set up this solidarity mechanism, because it showed that we could make progress on the different strands of the Pact at the same time: responsibility, solidarity, the external dimension, and the borders. And that's, I remember the criticism we faced at the time, sometimes from the Parliament, and we also had tough discussions with some Mediterranean member states who told us, but it's not a good deal, because we'll have texts, with legislative texts on responsibility, but regarding solidarity, it will be something flexible and temporary. But in fact, I think it contributed crucially to the momentum of the Pact, because it showed that member states were able to set up concretely and pragmatically a solidarity mechanism. And I think it's very important in view of the legislative discussions to come, because if we want this solidarity mechanism to be useful, not only on the short term, we have to draw lessons from the way it works. And that's a very important expectation from first country member states during the preparation phase of the presidency. And especially, I remember a mission I made in Rome. The Italians told me, the current proposals of the Commission doesn't fit us because it's too theoretical and it lacks previsibility. So the idea was to set up a non-legislative mechanism, but from which we could draw a lesson from a legislative point of view. If maybe I can elaborate later on the next steps, but I think that now we have different elements that are crucial in order, if we want to keep this momentum. I think we have to bear in mind that the Pact, of course, is a package, but I think we have to keep this pragmatic approach. Let's not try to reach a complete agreement on everything straight away. That's impossible. And I think that everybody has understood it now. And I recommend the discussions that are taking place currently with the Parliament in the framework of the contact group, because I think there's a very constructive climate, and it makes me quite optimistic.
Thank you so much, Jean. And I think you touched upon already so many issues that I also want to discuss today, and then also with Ms. Yoncheva and with Beate from the European Commission. So thank you so much for that. Thanks also for highlighting that France really tried to think out of the box to move forward on very difficult topics, and as you also mentioned, on the various challenges that were there, and that you still attempted to address both solidarity, but then also the responsibility part. And actually, this is, I think, a great moment to lead over to Ms. Yoncheva from the European Parliament. And just to reiterate, so the European Parliament is the co-legislator and has to find agreement on asylum and migration-related legislation together with the Council. You're a member of the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee, which handles the corresponding reform files for the European Parliament. And so my question would be, we've indeed now heard from Mr. Mafart on the achievements, but also on the challenges and the reasons why they chose also the gradual approach. And the question would be to you, what is the European Parliament's assessment of the state of EU migration and asylum policy and the progress made to date? Do you agree with Mr. Mafart?
Yes, thank you very much first for this possibility to take part in this important discussion. The new Pact of Migration and Asylum really is giving a lot of hope, but there are many concerns as well. And we know that since 2015 we are living in a permanent crisis of in the field of migration and asylum, and that's why we need really to make some reforms in the common European asylum system, not just to change 1, 2, 3 tools, but really to have a comprehensive common European asylum system that it's going to work in any cases, in any influx, and it's going to help any country, European country. So this reform, it's very, very important. When I came to the European Parliament and I started to work in this field as a rapporteur of the Asylum Agency, as the chair of the Asylum Contact Group, my colleagues were very, very pessimistic that we can bring results. But now we are dedicated, and I have a lot of hope that in the next 1 year and a half, till the end of this term of the Parliament, we really can bring results. So, but first we need to make compromise. And as Jean Mafart just said, we need to find the right compromises in order to finish the reforms and to make a common European asylum system work. Also, it's very important not to transform this discussion into a battlefield, how to reform some domestic issues, how to reform some problems in the field of justice or home affairs. And also this discussion should not turn into a debate about cooperation with third countries, or to turn into a debate how to make the border more secure, how to manage the border control, because this is not enough. This is not the way that we can really reform all the system. And I will give you 2 examples what we did for the first 3 years. First, we managed to build really this European Asylum Agency that before it was, she provided just a small service. Now she's acting as a fully fledged European Asylum Agency. And we can see how important, and it started in January this year, and we see how this is important when we look what's going on in Ukraine with this influx of millions of refugees. And second, I will give you another example. We managed to reach a roadmap between the European Parliament and 5 presidencies of the Council, starting with the French one and ending with the Belgian one, a roadmap that is going to work on the common European asylum system. And Monday, this Monday, we had the first meeting, which is, well, it's a great achievement, between the 5 rotating presidencies and the rapporteur of all the files in the European Parliament. And we started to work, and I hope we are going to bring concrete results.
Thank you so much, and I really, I'm very happy to hear also that there's this common, very positive approach, and I think we can also talk a bit more about basically also the asylum contact group and where that stands maybe also in the second round. I'd like to move to you, Beate. So, of course, we all know the Commission is the guardian of the treaties, but has also taken up an important role in coordinating operational responses to the EU's migration management challenges, including on solidarity and distribution. Could you tell us a bit more about the current work of the European Commission in addressing the challenges the Union is currently facing, and do you think the mechanisms put in place are successful?
Yeah, thank you for that challenging question. But perhaps I'd summarize a little bit, because I'm also the head of task force for migration management at the European Commission, in particular situated in DG Home. Mm-hmm. And this task force was established by the President of the Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, after the fire in Moria, because she basically said, look, you know, we have to be more active, more visible, and more in the countries to support them alongside our agencies. We have a very strong European support and response to our member states. Let's bring that more together and bring this more focus together. And that's how this task force was established. That works in a very, like the Team Europe approach I sketched out earlier, where we work towards globally towards our partners together with our member states. Here we work very closely with all our agencies, and I see Nina Gregori is here from the European Asylum Agency, who is a very active part of it, to bring the toolbox that we have to the countries that are particular under constraints and have specific problems to solve. We put that then into a concrete contract called Memorandum of Understanding with the member state. We have done that with Greece, we have done that with Cyprus, 2 countries that have been under particular pressure, where we say, this is the agency help that we give, this is the, you know, we will complement that with also financial support, but we will utmost try to coordinate all the many and often fragmented responses in each country towards the migration population, towards the local population as well, who is very often under stress, and towards the member states' systems which are under stress, the asylum system under stress, the reception system under stress. So let's try to find a more global response. And that has worked quite well. So far, I think we have made some quite positive experience in Greece. We have reduced the backlog on asylum applications there massively. We have also improved the reception system massively. And we're now focusing more on Cyprus, which is a very particular situation, being on an island, where we also work particularly strongly with Frontex on how to improve returns, because the island is obviously under heavy challenges. So this is one part of the toolbox, more focused, more coordinated, more operational response. in an area where, you know, where we have our current legislation in place, but work on the new legislation. And then to this start, we got additional tasks. One of them negotiated and proposed by the French presidency, which was, you know, the voluntary solidarity mechanism between member states, as the declaration in the Council approved by all ministers, where we try to have relocation and financial solidarity to member states under pressure. And we have a solidarity platform between member states chaired by the Commission, where we try to put this in practice. I have to say, we started in June and we're slow. We have made huge efforts, and helped by France and also particularly Germany, who were two big countries very much involved, to speed up. And we know also that in the countries that will get and benefit from relocation, mainly the obviously the Med countries, there have been enormous investments made to speed up the process. So while we started slow, I'm very positive that we will accelerate speed and increase on numbers of relocation. At the same time, we're also for the first time, and that's really a laboratory work, trying to initiate financial support between the member states, not going through the EU budget. So that's a completely new way of thinking, a new way of solidarity, and therefore I cannot announce a concrete project yet, because we're still, you know, trying to be to make the matchmaking, because it's complicated budget processes in the member states as well, so it has to fit in the member states' budgets. And then, of course, the Ukraine crisis also came along, and under the Temporary Protection Directive, the member states also enacted a solidarity platform, which I have the pleasure to chair. So suddenly we dealt with a completely different ballgame in terms of numbers, in terms of urgency, in terms of reception needs, and I'm very proud how we have managed that. But like you know, in the previous panel, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan said it's a huge challenge to shoulder these numbers, and it is also for Europe a huge challenge. So at the same time, I have to say I hope that the Pact gets agreed, because it has very important new rules which would make life of everyone easier, practical, more fit to purpose of the 2020th century, and would help us a lot to improve then the concrete operational response.
Thank you so much, Beate. I think that was really important. Also, it really shows all the complexities you deal with so well, and you know how big the challenges is that you're trying to address also through these different operational responses. I don't think that's always so clear to all of us, and I think it's sometimes also a bit almost confusing, because there's the voluntary solidarity mechanism that you're helping to put into practice, and then there's the solidarity platform that looks at supporting, you know, basically support to Ukraine and the displacement that the European member states have to deal with. So thank you so much for untangling also that for us. I'd actually like to dive right away into the second round, and I'd like to start, mix it a bit up. I'd like to start with you, Ms. Yoncheva, if you don't mind. I think you already explained very well, and I think, Jean, you also mentioned it, that now the European Parliament and the rotating council presidencies have basically signed a roadmap on, you know, how can we move forward on the Pact, how can we make sure that we reform migration and asylum rules still during this legislative period. And as you mentioned, you're the head of the asylum contact group, so you basically lead this cooperation and the updates also between the parties and for the European Parliament. And I mean, you mentioned that you were hopeful, but I wanted to still ask you, you know, where do you see challenges, possible challenges, that in these upcoming negotiations, and how could they be overcome? And maybe you could even mention, you know, is there a red line for the European Parliament?
Yes, of course, there are many challenges, but I believe if you continue to work and pushing and find the right compromise, then we will achieve really this common European asylum system that is going to work. Well, the main challenge is the RAM regulation, I believe. This is Migration and Asylum Management Regulation. This is the keystone of all the reforms, and if you don't manage to adapt it, in this case, we will not be able to speak about the European asylum system really working. And the other very important point is the relocation element, which is very important part of this reform, the solidarity mechanism. I believe this principle of first entry should not, a first entry country should not be applied in the future. We should distribute all the burden between the European countries. And I want to give you one example, a good example, what the European Union achieved. You already spoke about this, about the temporary protection directive that worked great during this Ukrainian crisis and provided internal protection. It's an emergency mechanism. You know that the temporary protection directive was elaborated 20 years ago, and it started to work now for the first time in a very successful way. But this internal distribution of refugees within the European Union was not limiting to the first country of entry, and this was very helpful for the refugees. And the burden, the responsibility was shared between the different countries. If you need to take some lessons from this temporary protection directive, we can see that many people coming from Ukraine, refugees, it was up to them to decide where to go, in which country. And sometimes they're not limiting their entry just to the first country. For instance, Bulgaria, which is not a neighboring country, Romania is closer to Ukraine. In Bulgaria, we had 3 times more refugees from Ukraine because they choose a country that it's more, where their adaptation will be much easier because of the language, because of some cultural similarities. So this is a conclusion that we need to trigger. It's not the migration a la carte that we need to follow, but we need to take into account also the possible integration of the future refugees.
Thank you so much. So actually, I'd like to take up on something you just mentioned. I mean, I think it's very well known that the asylum and migration management reform, that's really a big issue to work on because it's really supposed to replace Dublin. I actually, Jean, I had a different question for you, but I just wanted to ask you, do you think it's realistic that they will, basically the country of first entry rule will be scrapped from this?
No. And I don't think that's what the Commission intended in their initial proposal. This principle will remain, I think, but all what we were speaking about in terms of solidarity, external dimension, has to progress as well, because it's once again the Pact is a package. It's a comprehensive approach. As we said, as we all noted, we have a real momentum now. In part thanks to the roadmap with the Parliament. That's why I said previously that it makes me optimistic. We are engaged together in this political momentum. But we also have to be aware that we also have to keep more widely what I would call the cooperative approach in face of illegal flows. I noted the paradox previously when I said that the more important the flows are, the more difficult it is to speak quietly about these issues. What we are observing now is a very important development of illegal flows to Europe, and I think it's a real threat for the climate of the discussions. And we all know as well that there are elections to come in several member states. There have been already elections in some important states of the European Union, and I think it's a very important condition of the upcoming discussions on the Pact. We have to keep the cooperative approach. What will be key, I think, is in the next step as well, will be the proper functioning of the solidarity mechanism. It was a very important step to be able to agree on that solidarity mechanism, but we need it to work. And as Beate said, it works, but it started slowly. There already have been relocations in France and Germany, but it's the beginning of the process, and obviously we have to accelerate, because if we are not able to prove that such a solidarity mechanism works, it will be. I think the process will be finished. It will be impossible to make progress, because we can't make the pact between a solidarity mechanism first in this informal and temporary framework, and later in the asylum migration management regulation. So the role of the Commission is crucial in that respect, the role of the agencies as well, and in particular the Asylum Agency, and thanks to the Commission and the agency for their efforts. And of course the efforts of Member States will be crucial as well, and we wish that more Member States took part in the solidarity mechanism, but if I'm not mistaken, I think we have 21 Member States to date, and that's a very high figure, and that's very encouraging. One other very crucial aspect, I think, is our ability to continue working with the Parliament. We all know that the Council and the Parliament traditionally have not exactly the same approach, but it's normal. It's not a problem in itself. So we have to be able to speak to each other, to confront our approaches with the Commission, of course, and that's what's happening. This asylum contact group is very useful. We have this roadmap, but I think it's important to remind, including to the Parliament, that we are not only dealing with asylum. We are dealing with the Pact, which is a more broader framework. So we speak about responsibility, about solidarity, but we also have to bear in mind other dimensions of the Pact. I mean, in particular, borders and the external dimension. And the borders, I think it's very important from many points of view, politically, because if we're not able to set up a strong border, a strong external border, it will be difficult to obtain concessions from Member States which are not very open traditionally to solidarity. In itself, operationally, it's very important as well to curb migration illegal flows, but it's also important in terms of solidarity, because it's impossible to set up a solidarity mechanism without reliable and strong border procedures. So in that respect, the screening regulation is also very important, and also the asylum procedures regulation. These two legislative proposals set up, I hope, efficient border procedures, and that's very important, including, I repeat, in terms of solidarity. And last point, maybe we'll be surprised, but that's I think this issue is very important. We also need, apart from the Pact itself, we also need a migration agreement with the UK. I know the Commission is a bit reluctant on that idea, but we need that agreement with the UK, because one of our problems currently is that there is no more legal path to the UK, and that, of course, contributes to the development of illegal flows to Europe and within Europe, and we are convinced from the beginning that we need from the beginning, I mean from the Brexit, that we need this agreement with the UK in order to restore a legal path to the UK, and maybe it will make us avoid dramatic situations. And in parallel, in this agreement, we need a readmission mechanism to the European Union in exchange. And if we have this framework, this migration framework with the UK, I'm convinced that it will help us solve our migratory problems. Migration is not only a problem, of course, it's an important element of our lives, and I don't want to seem to present migration as a problem. It's not the case, but that's why the comprehensive approach of the Pact has to be promoted and developed, I think.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mafart. I think it really shows that, I think we've heard it so much over the last days. We can't do it alone. In the end, for everything on the Pact and with view to migration, everybody has to be on board. And I also like that you added to the mix also the agreement with the UK. It just shows again that even if the Pact is adopted, I think we will also continue to have to work on other agreements in order to really solve the challenges that we're facing. Now, I had shared a question, and I still want to also ask you another question, because we had been. The title of the panel is still, are we breaking gridlocks? And for me, the question would be going into the direction of looking a bit closer at the current gridlocks, because it could be said that looking back at 20 years of the common European asylum system, that until 2015, it was still possible to find solutions. And now I heard a lot of hopeful, messages from you on the way forward. But it still seems that it will be challenges. So for me, the question is, with a view to the existing gridlocks, do you think they're due to the fact that there's a common vision is missing and that we're too focused on the legislative details?
Obviously, there are differences of approach, I said, between the Council and the Parliament, also inside the Council, of course. But, and the very ancient discussion between solidarity and responsibility is continuing, of course, with, and this difference of approach is very obvious in that respect. We still have countries that advocate a stronger effort on responsibility and other ones insisting on responsibility. But I really believe in the comprehensive approach that was proposed in 2020 by the Commission in the framework of the Pact, and this, I think, this momentum, if we don't lose sight of this comprehensive approach, can bring us to an agreement. And of course, in the final agreement, we won't have all what the Commission proposed initially. I wish it would be possible, but obviously it's not. But every compromise, it's a compromise. So necessarily, everyone will have to make concessions. But I think the gridlocks you mentioned are not. I really think we can't go beyond. And I really think the current phase is totally crucial.
No, thank you so much. And I think it's really, maybe this is just also the tool that we need at this moment, and this is what we have to work with. So thank you so much. I'd like to ask also you, Ms. Gminder, another question. And I think you already mentioned all the different tools that you've put in place, but I still want to look a bit closer into crisis response, which is, again, also then part of your portfolio. What would you say has the EC learned, the European Commission learned from recent crises on what works and what doesn't work? Is the Commission better prepared today to respond to future emergencies?
I think we are much better prepared than we are 10 years ago. It starts with something that sounds like not important, but it's the first phase is data collection. What is actually happening? What is my situational picture? We have improved that a lot. We have a European network, which is called Blueprint, which works together on data exchange. And I think, the analysis of the data, which feeds then back into the member states and the council through an integrated situational awareness report, is something that we didn't have 10 years ago. And it is something very important for managing a crisis, to have data and draw conclusions from the data. I think we have much better equipped our agencies. It was mentioned already. All of them. There are 6 in the area of Justice and Home Affairs, or even 7, and they're at full cruising speed. However, I think where we are lacking now is clarity, and that would be my big plea to the Parliament and to the Council. We know that the ideal scenario that we have always, we always try to propose an ideal scenario. We have lots of discussions before we propose something. And one of the things we discuss is, of course, if we propose that, it might not be accepted, and then we get into a compromise, and that compromise is not we cannot operationalize the compromise. So we know we have to agree on a compromise, but it should be clarity on rules. Because what we have today is, a new set of rules proposed, while the old set of rules is still in operation, and it creates a lot of ambiguity between the new and the current set. And I think also for the people who want to come to the European Union, it's important to be clear on our rules. We have an asylum and protection system, and we want this system to work for those that are in need of asylum and protection. But we also have border rules in place, and it is clear that you cannot just cross a border as such. This is not entitlement. So that also needs to be communicated clearly. And we have a set of rules on when you arrive in the European Union, when you ask for asylum, what happens with you then? And that set of rules is also not clearly applied any longer. And that's part of the problem of voluntary solidarity, because the responsibility part is not is weaker at the moment. And people play with that. And we have a responsibility always also towards our employers, who are in big need of labor and are looking for this labor also abroad. And one of the motives of people who are not really in need of protection arriving at our borders is they know I find a good job, and they all find a good job. So there is a need for labor, and that's why it's so important to bring these different strands together. And again here, we should be clear on our rules so that we can also give that message. If you want to come to Europe, we need you, but we need you with your passport, and we need you with your identity, and then we want you not to be exploited in an illegal job with very low salary, but to be fully fledged into the system.
Thank you so much, especially on mentioning also the clarity aspect. It sounds also that we don't really have much choice but to really move forward on the Pact and to adopt it at the time that is left under this legislative period. So I'd like to actually finish this round again with you, Susan. We heard so many different things now, so many different points on the different mechanisms, on the different technicalities. So my question to you is that it must be very difficult as a journalist to really, understand what the gist is.
Yeah, well, I think, the takeaway here is the message from the Parliament. That was a very strong statement about immediately saying about redistribution and trying to learn lessons from the Temporary Protection Directive, which I thought was a very interesting point. But I think it's going to be pushed back on. But I think that gives an insight into the difficulties now ahead to get this over the line with the Parliament. Now, I know I started off by saying this positivity about getting something done in the Swedish-Spanish presidencies, but the reality is European Parliament elections are coming up as well, and that's going to really weigh, I think, on this discussion. So the nearer you get to those elections, there seems to be a bit of a lull at the moment under the Czech presidency, and the Council and Parliament doing their thing. But once this comes back with a bang, it'll be just getting into that campaigning period as well, which is an issue. I mean, I think as well, on the big picture, the difficulty for European citizens and for maybe campaigners for refugee rights is, of course, it's a simple point, but that the really, really quick response of the European Union to the Ukrainian refugees, and yet we can't get the Migration Pact over the line. And I know the Temporary Protection Direct, you know, it's different, but that's still that political that message that is sending is still difficult to explain and justify to some people. And then on the point of the labour, I think it's a really good point. We all know that the economic reality is that Europe has got a labour market shortage, obviously. But I think the big problem brewing will be housing, and both in terms of Ukrainian refugees and also other refugees, that this is becoming already a problem, even with the strong solidarity among European member states for Ukrainian refugees. I think that's a huge, we know about the inflationary pressures, but it's the housing, I think that's where the pressure point is going to be, and it's something to be concerned about.
Yeah. No, again, also thank you so much for helping to break it down. I think it's again, for those not part of the EU discussions on an everyday basis, it's not so easy to follow. And
well, it's hard. I mean, one of the challenges for migration policymakers is keeping it on the agenda as an issue. So there's a JHA meeting actually this week, Thursday and Friday in Luxembourg, Justice and Home Affairs Ministers, and there are so many things on the agenda. There's a whole discussion about Ukraine's should there be an international criminal court tribunal into the war crimes? That's on it. You're talking about policing. You're talking about everything. So the Migration Pact is just one bit of migration policy, which is just one bit of the whole gamut of the European Commission's policy perspectives. So one of the things I've taken from this conference, which is very interesting, is this concern in this part of Europe about the Western Balkans route. And that looks like it's now, really going to be on the agenda in Luxembourg in the next couple of days. But that really didn't break through to Brussels as an issue. Austria, it's obviously a big issue, but no one's really been reporting on it. It hasn't been a huge discussion. So, a cynic would say, and I think I would say, that sometimes with migration, it's when the big countries get worried, then it gets on the agenda. So once Germany gets concerned, it's on the agenda. That seems to be what's going to happen with this Western Balkans route discussion, for example. But yeah, it's just a challenge to keep the focus on it and keep then the momentum behind it when there are so many other topics vying for attention.
No, definitely. Thank you so much, Susan. I'd like to actually now, we have time for question and answers. I'm very proud of that. Thank you so much for helping to keep the discussions also short. I'd like to give you the opportunity to comment, ask questions. I would just like to ask you that if you're asking a question or comment, please stand up, say your name, your affiliation, and if it's a question, it would be very helpful if you could let us know to whom it's directed. It just makes it easier to answer. Right here.
Hello, I'm Beate. I work at the Martin Center in Brussels. I'd like to ask maybe a volunteer from the panel about a piece of legislation which was not part of the new Pact proposals. That's the instrumentalisation directive. How would you see a potential adoption of this piece of legislation and its effect on the new Pact? Would it help? Would it not help, or would it be neutral?
Thank you so much. I'd like to collect maybe some questions. Sorry, Hugo. Yes, please.
Hi, sorry for taking the floor so often. I just wanted to ask a question on practicality on screening. I think it's been a while now since I read the original proposal, but I think the goal is to do screening in something like 5 days. And Jean, you very correctly said, actually, border control and solidarity are not in conflict. They're completely symbiont. So as regards the practicality of implementing this, and by the way, just a side point, I've been really amazed at the positivity. I can't claim to speak for the room, but a lot of people think we're going to get a deal. I'm a little bit more pessimistic, but I just wanted to ask, and anyone can take the question, is screening people in 5 days really very realistic when we look at the Netherlands, for example, which was considered like absolutely one of the best asylum systems in Europe, currently under a lot of pressure, failing to do that, etc. How can we convince, including also the legislators, that this can work?
Thank you. Yes. Yes, sorry, I can't see. Yes, please.
Anne Schreiber, Austrian Foreign Ministry. My question would be to Jean Mafart. The new solidarity mechanism, what would you see as the reason why up to now there have been only very few cases processed? Is it because it's complicated? Is it lack of demand? Is it lack of interest? And a question to MEP Mrs. Yoncheva. The screening regulation, it was a bit of a surprise that this passed so quickly in the Council, but now there's no position by the, as I understand, no position yet by the European Parliament. Is this due to procedural reasons, or is there any substantial problem with that? Thank you.
Thank you. You don't see any other hands right now, so maybe would you start, Jean, maybe with the questions on screening, maybe both from Hugo, but also from also Ministry of Interior. Okay, no, I'm sorry, did he? So it's very not easy to hear. Okay, thanks. Please.
Regarding the screening, and maybe Beate will complement. The screening can't work alone. It's once again, it's a wall, and there's a continuity operationally between the screening and the asylum procedure regulation, because the purpose of the screening is to direct a migrant to the relevant procedure, either border asylum or border return. And I think it's a crucial tool because we've been confronted for years with the same problem. A migrant who entered the European Union, in reality, has a huge probability to remain in the European Union. So we have to tackle the issue upstream. Upstream, of course, in origin and transit countries, but upstream at the external border. And that's the purpose of the screening, combined with other procedures. And I think it's very important to keep that continuity. I agree that the screening alone won't work.
Ms. Yoncheva, maybe do you also want to answer to the question with a view to basically the state of the screening directive right now in the European Parliament?
Yes, now we are working, as I said, on a joining roadmap between the European Parliament, the 5 rotating presidencies, and this Monday we had a coordination meeting, also with the presence of a commissioner, with the Commission. So we are trying to make the right compromises in order to adopt all the files of the Common European Asylum System in the next 1 year and a half. And I believe the right compromises, we are going to do this, and next year, in January, to start the trialogues in order to close all the files.
Yes, please.
Sorry if I can complement my own reply to Hugo. Previously I mentioned that those border procedures are crucial in terms of solidarity, but your question gives me the opportunity to explain it maybe more precisely. I said there's a continuity between screening, border asylum, but I should add screening, border procedures, and solidarity. Because currently we have a solidarity mechanism, but historically we have quite an informal solidarity, a de facto solidarity. In practice, it's secondary flows. It's a form of solidarity, but it's not a good form of solidarity, because we need a solidarity mechanism which applies to people in need of protection. And that's also an important element of the procedures we intend to set up at the external border. If we're able to set up that kind of procedures at the external border, will be able to carry out solidarity, real solidarity, applying to people that really need it. And that's why I said previously that the screening is important from that point of view as well.
Thanks so much. We had also a question on the instrumentalisation directive. Yes, please. Beate.
Yeah, perhaps I complement a bit the previous answers. I'm amongst the not pessimistic but optimistic one. I think we have such a high-level commitment on Council and Parliament side that if it doesn't work now, when will it ever work? But of course, it is an uphill challenge. On the instrumentalisation, there has been also first discussions in Council and Parliament. The instrumentalisation proposal is basically taking together a lot of rules that are already in other legislation, so that to make the procedure faster, to prolong a little bit the deadlines. It doesn't touch as such the asylum procedure, but it makes it more flexible and faster and more adapted to the situation that a lot of people arrive at the border at the same time. So I think personally that we don't need it absolutely, because the rules are there also in other laws. It brings it together, but it would be good to have as part of the toolbox. But of course there will be further discussions about that, because we have also proposed rules for the situation of crisis, and of course perhaps they could even be further aligned. And as you have seen from the Temporary Protection Directive, we have actually proposed to replace it with the crisis proposal. So, we activated something that we had proposed to replace. There were quite some discussions about that. But at the same time, we also felt, we are the directly neighboring entity next to Ukraine. We were not knowing how many people would exit Ukraine very quickly. We knew they had to exit very quickly. So, we knew also we had to provide a system, and that's part of a crisis. And that's why we have also proposed to have a crisis regulation. We knew we would have a system that would allow us all to do this as easy as possible. And that was the entire intention. And the last question, which was about why so few for relocation, you asked that for that. I think it's because we have a workflow, and this was also very quickly agreed. But we have, of course, the member states that are taking people to have certain criteria, and we have those that are at the front, at the border, that they have to put together a pool that fulfills this criteria. And this matchmaking is not always the easiest. Also because, as I said, and that's why I've been pleading so much for clarity also towards the people arriving, people don't know that we're doing this exercise, and some people walk with their own feet, to be very blunt. So before you can relocate them, they have already taken their destiny in their own hand. So I think it is something where we need to have a bit more time. I'm glad that we have that year. I'm glad that we have a lot of political willingness, and I think in terms of practicalities, we are overcoming the first initial capacity issues, and I'm hopeful that we will then accelerate in terms of pace.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for also taking up the question on the cases. That's very important. I think we would have time for some more questions, just in case.
Everyone is tired about us.
Yeah. Well, then I would have just a final brief round. That's okay. We also understand this is the last panel discussion before the well-deserved lunch. But so actually, I must say now I'm a bit. I had wanted to ask you, and I might still ask it actually, but just ask you to respond very briefly on a question on what, in your opinion, do you think would be the most important step to take now to find agreement on a policy agenda that responds to current migration management challenges? You've been very positive now, but I still think maybe if there's one concrete thing for each of you to hear, that'd be wonderful. And maybe Beate, we can start with you.
I personally believe we have to make legal labor schemes work at a much higher pace than today. And then the rest falls into play.
Thank you so much. Yoncheva.
Yes, we may have in the future a perfect common European asylum system, but we should not forget that this is just an instrument. We can't limit all the negative effects connected with with all those problems. So we need to limit the sources that cause all this migration, and this is the economical situation, the wars in the third countries. I've been a war reporter during the last 20 years, and I saw what the war is causing. So we need to work more on that direction.
Thank you so much. Jean, please.
Well, I think it's very simple, in theory, not in practice. Our societies are more and more nervous about migration. So I think policymakers have to show that migration is under control. It means developing legal migration, legal path. Yeah. That's what Beate said. Although, of course, professional migration is not the only kind of legal migration. And we have to protect our borders because we're in a system that, of course, it was said before, it's always terrible situations for migrants. It's never their first choice, and most of them undertake that travel it must be very difficult and it's very dangerous. That's sure, but we're in a system that rewards illegal entry in the European Union. So we have to develop legal ways while controlling our external border, and that's the reason why I insisted several times on the fact that the Pact is a comprehensive approach and that we have to keep it.
Thank you so much. Susan, you always have an extra question for you.
Oh.
but because and you mentioned it, you don't only observe migration, you observe EU migration policy overall. And my question to you would be, what do you think is the next big issue that migration policymakers should be looking out for?
Well, I think it's going to need huge political skill to get this pact over the line, as we discussed, particularly with the Parliament. And we've got some unknown faces, new faces around the European Council table in the next few months. And I think that it'll be interesting to watch how that develops. But again, even though it's moving to this phase of the process, I suppose maybe more, not to criticise on the Commission, but the external aspect of it, the dialogue. I know this is part of the previous panel, but the dialogue with those countries outside the EU. I mean, we saw it a bit with this, Commissioner Skinas going to Serbia, going to the Western Balkans, but trying to have a more, long-term approach, a more strategic approach before it becomes a problem internally. Because I do think if there is not progress on this, the implications for the European Parliament election in 2024 will be quite interesting to watch. And I know a lot of people in Brussels and a lot of the Brussels establishment talk a lot about populism and the threats of populism. This is a crucial issue when it comes to populism. Yeah. So it's incumbent now, after all these years, for the EU system to show it can get a handle, that it can progress it. And as I say, it'll take a lot of political skill in the next 18 months to get that over the line.
Yeah, and it needs a lot of journalistic skill also to, inform the public. To explain it, definitely. Yeah. So all that we have left now is for me to close this session. And I just wanted to highlight that I'm very surprised that there was such a positive tone on this discussion, that we can get the new pact over the line. I'm very happy. So I think that's my main takeaway from this session, that I'm very much looking forward now at all the legislative files moving forward. I also like that you mentioned again this, the new pact is really a comprehensive approach, and it includes legal pathways and it includes border control, and that is something that we have to keep in mind, even if the discussions or the challenging discussion are very much focused also on solidarity and the asylum management reform and so on. But the new pact is much more than that. And so the Commission has really done a great job in trying to really propose and bring everything in for the way forward. Yes, and with that, to all of you, thank you so much for joining me here today. It was really great to moderate this panel. Thanks for sharing your expertise and your insights, and for really trying to bring the message across about all the complex work that you do every day. And well, also thanks for coming to Vienna for this panel. I hope you enjoyed the conference. And well, to you, the audience, also thanks for the questions. And I think with that, we can close the panel. Thank you so much. All that remains now is the formal closing of the conference. Thanks.